The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Anna Zylik, and I am with ICF. We are the vendor working on behalf of Energize Connecticut to bring these Passive House trainings to all of you. Thanks for joining us today for this Passive House webinar. We are recording this training, and we will make this available afterwards. And these trainings are at no cost thanks to the sponsors of Energize Connecticut. These trainings are also in partnership with Connecticut Passive House. A reminder that the Energize Connecticut program is offering a 50% cost reimbursement for professionals pursuing either FIAS or FIA accreditation trainings. This includes the cost of the trainings and the exam, and once you become certified, we'll work with you to process the 50% cost reimbursement. Our email will be on the last slide. If you do have any questions about the reimbursements, just please reach out through our email. And with that, I will pass it over to Keegan, who's also with ICF, to talk about the Connecticut Passive House building incentives.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So in addition to these free trainings and the certification reimbursements brought to you by the sponsors of Energize Connecticut, they're also really excited to offer incentives for construction projects, residential construction projects that pursue Passive House certification in projects that are 5 units or more. So you can see on the slide the outline of the incentive structure. It's broken out so that there are incentive and support along each step of the way for the project pursuing certification. So if you have more questions about that or a project that you would like to consider for the incentive path, please take down the information there and reach out to us. So with that, I will introduce our speakers today, Bronwyn Berry and Dylan Martello. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Keegan, and thank you, Anna, and to the sponsors for inviting us here and hosting this interesting, if somewhat geeky, presentation about factoring in electrification. My co-presenter is with me here, Dylan Martello, and hey there. So we will we'll be covering quite a lot of quite juicy information. But before I get started, I would like to find out who is on the call and what your profession is. And I'd like to ask Keegan if he could sort of give a, to use the chat, if you would, and to just post and let us know if you're an architect, a policymaker, an energy modeler, an engineer, a contractor. Please tell us your interest in this, just so that I can, both Dylan and I can really, speak to your profession a little bit more directly as we go through these slides. So I'm going to give you a couple seconds, use the chat, and we'll hear from you about what you're doing, so that I know how to frame this a little more specifically for you.
Sure, yeah, so far we've got definitely a good contingent of architects. We've got a couple electrical engineers, an architect and policymaker, electrical contractor and inspector, building official, and green building consultant. Let's see, HVAC contractor.
Fabulous. Okay, great. That's a good spectrum, which means this is, this is well suited for your, for all of you. And I'll sort of touch on various aspects that impact your particular professions as I go through. So, everybody, you can see the slides. I'm all set to run, right?
Yep.
Great. All right. So, what we'll cover today, we really start at a really high level. Back to basics, just so that we make sure that everybody can follow along. And I'm going to look at what a primary energy factor actually is. Not too complicated. Then I'll go into how do we structure that for renewable energy grid. And I'll look at specifically how the Passive House Institute has structured their energy model to account for those particular factors. And then we'll look at how this gets to be applied in your region. And we'll also just do a quick review of how this gets changed for other regions as well. And then Dylan will take you through a real project and really look at that specifically. So architects, engineers, electrical engineers, HVAC contractors, you can start to really see how this applies directly to your work. And then we'll open it up for discussion. So I'm going to start with the big, sorry, too many buttons to push here. I think we're all very aligned with where we need to go. There shouldn't be any argument about the fact that we've got to really transition our building and our living environments very rapidly to be much more sustainable and actually work on a renewable energy grid. And to recap too, so that everybody understands the difference between site energy, the energy used directly on our buildings and how we design them, and source energy, so where that energy comes from. And that sort of interaction is what we'll be looking at specifically today. I also want to show you in this little illustration, the summer use of energy and the winter use of energy also differ fairly significantly, both in the demand and in the production, specifically with renewables, both with solar and with wind. So it's not just a solar issue that we're looking at. And what I also want to show is the accounting of generation loss and line loss. So, obviously, that becomes a factor for all types of energy generation, some less than others. It depends on where it's generated. But what I really want to point out here is we can't just assume that what we use and what we generate are going to be equal. And we have to really account for this quite subtly and carefully. So really think about that as we come back. And this is also really important with regards to storage, because what you generate on your site is not necessarily stored by the grid, and it's a very subtle factor that we also have to account for. So if we go back to how an energy factor, an electrical energy factor is derived, we look at this sort of production timeline, and this is the old sort of school version, but it's a great illustration that I like to use, showing that when you extract the source energy, and at this for this illustration, it's called there's energy used in the extraction, in the transportation to the factory or the power station, where it's then converted into power, and then it's transmitted in along the power lines to the end use. And already in that, there's the line loss and the generation loss. So that is part of the factor. And if we look at sort of these old school source energy factors for electricity, generally electricity used to be about a 3.3 site to source energy ratio, which meant that for every 3 watts of energy, for every 1 watt of energy used, beg your pardon, it takes about 3.3 to actually generate that 1 watt that gets used at site. Solar and wind is much better source energy factor as 1, as is the old school, and then the big hairy monster on the horizon, natural gas, has also a much more efficient source energy factor, so not as much loss in the generation of that. But these are the old school factors, and the reality of our grid is changing rapidly because of the renewable energy generation. So And of course, the grid also is different, particularly depending on where you are located. So in the US here, our grid is divided into these different regional interconnected structures. In Connecticut, you're over here on the Eastern interconnection grid here. Out here in the West, I'm on the Western interconnection. And the source energy factors for all of these are actually quite different. So nationally, the average was at about 3.3. It has now actually dropped to 2.8. So it's got much better as we've transitioned. But historically, these are the numbers. The Eastern grid has been a lot more sort of, has had a higher than average source energy factor. This one down here, the ERCOT grid down in Texas, has been probably the highest, along with Alaska, which is quite ironic given how much energy they actually have. And this is all to do with the fact of what's available, what are the source energy options available in these regions. So on a very high level, you can see why those factors differ. Up on the northwest, there's a lot of hydropower, which has a much lower source energy factor, is already much greener. Out west here, we have tons of solar, but we have gas everywhere, and we have no coal to speak of. Midwest is wind generation, lots of wind resource, and the coal belt, the old Rust Belt, is really here, and that sort of has kept that grid quite dirty, but this is changing quite rapidly. And really on the East Coast, you guys are really pioneering lots of great wind. There is nuclear, there's also lots of solar, and you can see there's really gas everywhere, something that is becoming much more of an issue that we're all really looking hard at how to transform. And at the regulatory level, for you policymakers out there, this is sort of what is really driving a lot of these changes. At the high level policy, you know, we all know that we have to rapidly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and each state has different targets. This is a lovely graph that I found at the c2es.org website, and you can click on each state to see what the regulatory requirements and goals are, and the targets. And for Connecticut here, right now you have the blue is a statutory target, and it's 45% below 2001 levels by 2030. And this is sometimes, I have to say, as an architect, it's very difficult to connect what that means with what I'm doing at my building. And this is really what we're talking about specifically today, is how do we connect all the dots? How do we go from our energy code and making sure that what myself as an architect, engineers, HVAC contractors, what we're doing at the implementation level actually directly connects to the energy model that we're using, to the state greenhouse gas emissions targets that we are all on the hook to actually deliver. So policymakers, that's specifically, you know, how do we build those connections to make sure everybody's pushing in the same direction? And this is why and how the Passive House Institute restructured the back end of the Passive House planning package energy model to make sure that all of those things actually line up, and so that we're all pushing in the right direction. And so if we looked at how we needed to shift those old renewable energy factors to connect to what we're doing at the building level, we see that the renewables has a much better site utilization factor. So 3 times better than this old electric factor that was used to be structured based on a coal and fossil fuel powered grid. And so what the structure has really done is really transform what we need to be doing to say, let's favor renewable energy, source energy in the buildings, and let's disincentivize the non-renewables and the fossil fuels, the source energy that we don't want in our buildings. So how they went about this is they took a look at this whole big throughput, starting from, what are we, what's the end use, what's the source energy, and how is it going directly, either directly into our buildings or indirectly, what's being lost along the way, and then what capacity do we have for it to be stored? So both short-term storage with on-site batteries and longer-term storage, where which is a sort of an area that hasn't quite really been figured out yet, but it's in its nascent phase, and there's lots of interesting stuff coming out. But essentially, what we're seeing is the short-term storage issues are really already developed. We're starting to implement them at our buildings. Even the utilities are building large-scale versions of these short-term battery storage facilities. Long-term, as I said, it's kind of an interesting battle at the moment. Lots of hydrogen, methane storage, water, essentially hydro versions of that. And all of that really is factored into this structure, but not necessarily applied specifically to what we're doing at the building level. So what
Bronwyn,
yes.
there's one question I thought would be good to address while you're on the slide. So sure. Why are transmission losses, why are they not considered in this analysis where the source is the solar panels and the site would be the electrical panel, for example?
They definitely are. And we'll get to that. They still are a factor in, because you can see that there is a difference between when your energy is generated on site compared to off site. And so we will look at the nuance in that, but just sort of big picture, direct use is factored in here. And it's not necessarily shown on this particular graph, but you can have it be, on the site or through the grid. Does that answer that question, I hope?
Yeah, I think for now, yep.
All right. So just to recap, as everybody probably already knows, with renewable energy, timing is key. And what we really have to be very cognizant of the fact is that winter generation and summer generation really do differ remarkably because they don't necessarily align with the demand. So supply and demand don't necessarily align at the same time. And this is sort of the subtle difference of where Passive House diverges from a pure net zero definition, because it really does look specifically at that timing and that demand reduction. So just quick review, you can build a net zero house, and I'm not bad mouthing net zero. I think this is part of what we have to actually deliver. But where Passive House differs is it gets very specific about the heating demand loads and the heating and the cooling demand reductions. So either peak demand or so either load or peak demand. And just to show on this graph, the arc, the curve is the production, so energy production, specifically solar. For both these buildings, this is a low energy building, a net zero that would qualify as a net zero building. And this is a Passive House building, both in the same climate zone. And just the shaving of those seasonal loads is the key differentiator, and it allows the renewable demand to be a little closer to actually supply, but you can see it still doesn't actually totally cover it. So that's where storage becomes key factor. And if we look back at the Passive House targets, specifically for the PHPP targets, that's again, why cooling and heating demand numbers are very specific. You can also do the load numbers, peak heat load. Air tightness, of course, stayed the same for all buildings. And the total primary energy was really that big bucket of all the energy that gets used, was completely overhauled. And this was done in 2015, by the way, to really factor in these renewable demands. And it changed really the way buildings were, that full amount of energy that you're allowed to use for passive house was allocated. And just to clarify too, there are dehumidification factors allowed for specific climates, and those are very, baked into the PHPP when you do a project certification. So what this really did was overhaul passive house planning package to incentivize renewable energy resources and disincentivize non-renewable ones, and to create a carbon emissions focus. And I'll get back to that more, because it's all about those connecting the dots and linking all of those things that we have to do in order to transfer to this renewable energy grid. So the Passive House Institute established 3 certification levels. The old sort of basic is still in place, classic. And then they added the plus and the premium, which allowed people to actually either increase their efficiency or reduce their demand. So it's sort of a sliding scale. You can use either one of these tools to actually get to the next level, but it really does credit buildings that go all the way to this premium level of really super high generation, low demand, but it's a function of each. And this X this is a graph out of the PHPP and tells you where you are on this graph and how, if you tweak, you add more renewables, you can go to the next level, or if you reduce demand, you can also go to the next level. So, and the structure, as I said, as I've noted here, it heavily favors electric buildings and penalizes gas. Just a subtle differentiation. It doesn't say no to gas. It just makes gas appliances and equipment much harder to meet the passive house standard. And I think Dylan will probably address that specifically as we come along. So if we look at how these PER factors in the PHPP are derived, the basic still remains, which is total demand reduction. This is still key in the classic. You can build a passive house, a PER passive house, without energy generation, but there's still the basic demand reduction, the load reduction still remain. Then what the Institute did was they broke out the different types of energy used in a building into these 5 categories. And so total electric use, hot water use, heating use, cooling use, and dehumidification. And why they did that was because it's key, all of those have different time use allocations associated with them. So general electric use, what we would call a base load, is the electric use that a building uses consistently throughout the year. Hot water is another one that's consistent, but they disaggregated it from general electric because it's usually quite a high load and should be looked at specifically. Heating and cooling clearly happen seasonally, so those also differ, and it's very climate specific, so they have to be looked at in separate categories. And dehumidification is also a regional one. It's climate specific and it's also seasonal. So those are the 5 categories that they really broke out, and we'll look at that, how that works specifically in each climate coming ahead. It also looked at your building size and the amount of roof area that you have. And this is really important when we come to urban buildings or buildings with big shaded roofs that literally don't have the capacity to do solar generation at a rooftop. It also looked at the regional grid, how, what capacity is actually available in your region and what's actually possible. And then it looked at the regional peak load. What are the general needs for your area? And this is based on your climate and your geographic location, your, how close you are to the equator or to the poles, whether you're sort of a seaboard or a landlocked central location. And then it looked at renewable storage, what's possible, what's actually needed in your region, because some regions need much more storage. A house in Alaska or a building in Alaska has a much longer storage requirement demand than a building in San Diego, where the seasons really don't have a huge diurnal swing. And then finally, it also looked at your appliances, what the source energy of each kind of appliance is, and went very heavily in favor of heat pumps, which those decarbonization and electrification folks were probably very pleased to hear. And as I mentioned, the credits also very carefully looked at this equity factor. I don't know if you folks have seen the report issued by Rocky Mountain Institute called Beneficial Electrification, but it looked very specifically at how Passive House deals with electrification. And this was a core tenet of how the Passive House Institute restructured credits for renewable, which I thought was really innovative and very forward-thinking, which essentially what this illustration is showing, that really you only get credit for in relationship to the amount of projected floor area that your building has capacity for, rather than the total floor area. So this tall multifamily building really only has one floor area of roof space. And so that's what it's credited as a factor of, rather than the total floor area. And then off-site renewable is allowed for buildings that just literally don't have enough solar access, and urban buildings that really may be shaded by other buildings in their region. So it's got a little bit more of a nuance in terms of credits. So how does all this relate to your specific region? And this gets much more real when you actually start doing a project. And I'm just going to look at the big factors that apply. And in Connecticut, Dylan sent me 2 PHPPs that have these PER factors broken out in the PE tab. And just to show you, how we were talking about heating. Oops, sorry. Here, my clicks aren't quite working here. But here's the PER factors. These are both, they're basically were the same for Hartford and New Haven, Connecticut, and I'll show you how these changed depending on your region. But for heating electricity, the factor is a 1.5, rather than, remember, if you solar energy is 1, but electric, even with a compact a heat pump or a compact heat pump, they're giving an electric PER factor of 1.5. For cooling and dehumidification, depending on whether you're using a heat pump or auxiliary electricity, it goes from 1.85 to 1.5. And for domestic hot water, it's 1.15. So almost at parity for domestic hot water if you use a heat pump. And then there's a few other factors in here. Household electricity is at 1.2 is the PER factor. And if we look at this in other regions, this is when it starts to get really interesting, when you compare what the PER factors are for your region to a few other regions in your neighborhood. And these I've extracted from the PHPP. I've got Pittsburgh, Washington, DC, Philadelphia, New York, Buffalo, and Rochester. And you can see across the board, these are sort of ranging. Pittsburgh's a little higher at 1.6, but most of them are in the 1.55 for heating electricity from a heat pump. And it changes. Natural gas gets penalized. It gets bumped up to 1.75 for heating. Cooling and dehumidification is in a range of 1.5 to 1.44 and 1.6 for DC, which usually gets a little bit hotter. So cooling is a little bit more of an issue. You want to design to really not need that much cooling. And then this domestic hot water generation. For heat pumps, it's at 1.2 to 1.15. But for natural gas domestic hot water, it's at 1.75. So you get really, you don't get, it's not said you can't use gas, but you get pretty heavily dinged if you use a gas water heater. And then, so I pulled those out. If we go further up and we look at New Jersey and Pennsylvania, I did this for another webinar just to pull that out. The numbers are fairly similar with a few subtle nuances going up to 1.5 in those same regions. And then out the Rocky Mountains region, the electric factor changes quite dramatically. It's starting in the 1.95 and the 1.7 here. So this becomes much easier if you start to generate your own electricity on site, and you get a much better factor for on-site renewables, and that gets factored in your renewable generation tab. I haven't quite got all of the details for that, but it does get factored in and a credit for. But what's interesting here is the domestic hot water generation is a little better at 1.2, and cooling and dehumidification at 1.35. And then out west here, a slightly different animal. Electricity is at 1.75 for heating and cooling in where I am, or 1.7 in San Francisco, Sacramento, and San Diego. San Diego changes quite dramatically here. They obviously think that heating is not such an issue in San Diego. You don't get so penalized for it. So 1.3. And domestic hot water at about 1.2. So what I'm showing here is that transition. If we remember back to the slide that I had, the big historic energy factors for electricity, starting at the 3.3 for our national grid, the sort of national average, coming down to 2.8. This really does a next level step. And takes that down to actually real factors structured on real locations based on real capacity and real projects. So really the point I'm making here is what it's doing is it's connecting what we should be doing in our energy code with the specific energy model that we can use to design our building and the state's greenhouse gas targets. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Dylan to talk even more specific about some projects that he's been working on in your region. So,
thank you, Bronwyn. Thank you for that very thorough and detailed explanation of the PER factors in particular, because I think that is really plays an important role in the analysis that I'm about to show right here. So what I wanted to do was sort of put these numbers in action and show this as it relates to an actual building, an actual project in this region, and show how we look at and think about these source energy factors, how that actually impacts if we want to get a project certified for Passive House compliance and meet the Passive House thresholds. So before getting into the specifics on the project, let me quickly try to summarize something that I think can get confusing fast. So I'm going to try to kind of dumb it down a little bit. And basically what I want to do is highlight that the Passive House standard requires that we meet a whole building energy demand metric. And that metric needs to be shown compliance via the energy model or the PHPP. And that metric is what we call the primary energy. And it's, as Bronwyn was mentioning, it's the source energy demand in the building, thinking about the energy used not only at the site, but also in the transmission lines and the generation facilities and transportation that goes into that. Now, to certify, under the PHI standard, you can do one of two things. You can certify under what's called just the primary energy, or PE, or you can certify under the primary energy renewables, or PER threshold. Ultimately, right now, you can pick which one. I think where the Institute is going is they ultimately would like the PER demand to be the only source of modeling and showing compliance with this threshold. But right now, as it stands, and in the foreseeable near future, it's still going to be, you have the option to pick which to certify to. So the way to think about these is the PE, or primary energy, is really the source energy of the building under what I like to call today's grid. So those grid factors are more closely aligned to what we see today and what Bronwyn had mentioned. Now, I will say, for electricity, as you see here, it's 2.6 is that site to source factor, which is a actual, that number that was derived from PHI is actually sort of a global metric. They're just trying to create an equal playing field across all projects that are trying to certify. So you don't have, let's say, a project in the Pacific Northwest get sort of this benefit that's the same building design essentially as a building in the Northeast, because the Pacific Northwest is more hydro. So they try to sort of equalize for that issue. So it's this one metric, it's the 2.6 for electricity, and it's 1.1 for gas. But the important thing to think about here, as Bronwyn mentioned, is that natural gas under this metric actually is more favorable than electricity on a one-to-one basis in terms of a per kBtu of energy used. So essentially what is important to think about is really how this compares to the primary energy renewables. So, and actually before I jump to that, I do want to just highlight that this threshold target is anywhere between 38 to 45. It can even push higher than that for multifamily buildings that are really dense. It is sort of a project specific threshold that gets determined, but that's roughly the actual primary energy threshold that you need to meet, or think of it as almost like a source energy use intensity, essentially. Now, moving on to the primary energy renewables, or PER, the way to think about this is essentially it's the source energy use of the building, but under a green grid. So a grid that has distributed generation, it's got more renewables on, it's got energy storage mechanisms in it. Really the grid that we are progressing towards and hope to see in, I would like to say in the near future, but it might be, the next 20 or 30 years before we really start to see this sort of take fruition. But this is essentially the way to think about this. And as Bronwyn had mentioned, and I'm not going to sort of belabor this too much more, but that electricity site to source factor is now much lower than the 2.6 that it was under the PE standard. It can vary depending on region. I have 1.1 to 1.3 in here, but it really depends on the location and the use type. But the highlight here is that it's about twice as good, or basically half of the impact that it was under the PE threshold. So you don't get dinged as much for using electricity under the PER threshold. And the sort of opposite holds true for the natural gas. So again, we're going from 1.1 under the PE standard up to 1.75 under the PER standard. So just keep this in mind, and as I mentioned before, you can choose to certify under either path at this point. But really what this means when you sort of boil all this down and try to think about it as a sort of whole here is that if you're going to design an all electric building, you're going to certify to the PER path. And that's pretty much the way to go. The other element to this is that it does allow you to take credit for renewable energy production, whereas under the PE standard, you can't do that. Okay, you can go to the next slide, Bronwyn.
Oh, sorry, I forgot these.
Oh, you know what? That's actually fine. You can actually stay on that for one more moment. So the way that we check for compliance for the primary energy renewables, this is a little bit more nuanced here under the standard, and that's essentially because they allow you to take credit for primary energy production or renewable energy production on site. So this graph here on the right sort of summarizes this, and I like to just say, like, very simply, you want to get the red X in the red or the orange region. That's like the goal. And to go left on this graph, you basically reduce your building's EUI, or energy used. To go up on this graph, you increase the amount of production on site, or renewable energy production. There are some additional lines here for the plus and premium classes, which are a little bit more challenging to get to, but actually are possible even for large projects. Okay, next slide. All right, so this is an example project. This one is in New York City, but I wanted to highlight this because it's a large multi-family project that we know there's a lot of development, especially in Connecticut. There's some, large scale, mid-rise, even potentially high-rise sort of type multi-family buildings. It's a huge market sector. And one of the biggest challenges as we think about electrification, and I'm sure as a lot of you are already aware, is how do we electrify domestic hot water generation on site? And that's one of the biggest nuts to crack. And we have good options already on the market that have been tried and true and are being used throughout the area for space heating with a heat pump system or an electric-based system. But the energy produced, or the energy production for hot water is really the tougher nut to crack. So what I'm doing here is I'm highlighting a project that is actually in design right now that has an all-electric centralized heat pump water heating plant in their design that they're looking to install. And I'm showing here, as you remember, the goal is to get the X on this graph into the orange region. So what I did is kind of created an equivalent of this graph so you can sort of see the primary energy and how this is treated. So what we looked at is the green scenario, or the green X, is our all-electric version of the same building. So everything is the same in these two scenarios, except for the fact that we have heat pump water heating for the domestic hot water system. We are assuming a COP on average for domestic hot water of 2.0, which is, I think, a very it is a conservative estimate. I think it's also a very realistic estimate, however, because in our climate here, cold climate heat pumps performance does drop in extremely cold temperatures. So that is something that we do want to consider. But I am just want to highlighting that that COP of 2.0, I think, is a fairly realistic but also conservative estimate. And then in red, we have what I'm calling the gas boiler domestic hot water scenario, which is more typical to what we see in most buildings that have centralized hot water systems. And as we're seeing here on the left, which has the primary energy graph, we have the gas domestic hot water system is actually in compliance, whereas the electrified version of this building, even with heat pump water heaters, is still not meeting the primary energy demand threshold. It's slightly over that threshold. So, we're really sort of running into seeing this interesting dynamic here where you could get a better building, but it just doesn't, because these source energy factors are so different for electricity and natural gas under today's grid. The gas version of this building does actually perform better according to this calculation. But we're designing buildings that are going to last, and that's the thing we need to think about here. Is we can't just think about our buildings as they're going to sort of operate today, because they're going to be around for way longer than just the next 5 years. And that's why we're sort of thinking about our buildings under this PER metric. And the electrified version of that building performs much better as it pertains to the natural gas version. And that's what we're sort of seeing here on the right, is the electrified version of the building is much, much better and in compliance on the primary energy demand threshold when compared to the gas domestic hot water system. So what we're seeing is, even though our buildings aren't as good today in terms of the source energy use, because we still have fossil fuels producing electricity, as we get into the future, our electric version of these buildings are going to be much better than the gas version of these buildings. So that's really something to keep in mind. And we could get into, you know, a lot about the state of the technology of heat pump water heating and all that sort of thing. So I want to leave that more for the question side of things. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions and good discussion on that. But the last thing I just want to sort of summarize here is that we are, you know, prior to the last year or so, pretty much all of the projects that we've seen at our company going for passive house certification, which was upwards of about 30, pretty much all went through the PE method. But now we're starting to see the shift that all of our projects are now thinking about all electric and are now shifting towards the PER demand method. So we really need to start thinking in this way as we continue to think about how we're designing our buildings, and even setting up codes, as Bronwyn had mentioned, and incentive programs and things like that. So I just wanted to sort of highlight that aspect of this discussion as well. Okay.
And that's a perfect segue to the closing slides. Thanks, Dylan. Because it's a really interesting discussion. I mean, really what you're showing here is, you know, the old structure is still in circulation, but it is transitioning because of the push to, you know, all electric buildings. And just sort of my own projects, I've actually been using the PER framework since 2015 when it first came out, because we already were doing all electric buildings here. But I am out in California, and we, you know, we've been doing things a little differently, and I'm also only working in sort of small scale residential, which is a very different cost calculus once you actually look at what the actual operational costs are. So really just a quick summary of the whole PER framework. Really what it's doing is it's prioritizing demand reductions still. That is the key for passive house. Efficiency still is the first utilization factor. It's the key to all of passive house, whether it's PE or PER. But the PER framework is the one that I really, in my policy advocacy work, it's really the only passive house standard that I think we should be promoting is an all electric building, and the PER framework is the one that does that really specifically, really regionally, and really for your own local climate in a way that's quite sophisticated and subtle, without messing with all the front end targets and making it complicated for policymakers to say, oh, too many other numbers. It also gives credit to the on-site generation. It factors in off-site generation, but just key off-site generation is only given credit on the plus and premium, not on the classic. You have to have the bigger buildings to really make the off-site allowable. And it also does stuff like allowing green roofs. So, you know, these are things that we start to, you know, really need to have that subtlety in our urban environment to allow things like that. Sorry about that phone. I'm going to just let it ring if you don't mind ignoring it. Just last closing notes, the PER factors can also be customized. There is capacity in the PHPP to input local specific ones if your grid has a particular nuance that isn't calculated. And you know, the Passive House Institute is very interested in hearing how this gets implemented and what local utilities and policymakers really want from this framework. It's highly adaptable, and it's pretty fascinating to see how it's being rolled out, not only here in the US, but internationally, because this is something that as an entire planet, we all have to really get our head around and tackle. So last thanks and credits, lots of source material that I've used to generate the slide deck. The geeky stuff can be all read on Pacipedia. I encourage you to go and have a look at pacipedia.org. Lots of even more sort of nuanced technical back-end information about how this is structured. I've written about this for a while, looking specifically at California and my own projects here, and the electrification of those, and why that's been a smart thing to do since 2013. And I'm sure Dylan has some other information that he'd like to share if you'd like to add any notes, Dylan, before we head to questions.
Yeah, so I think what I want to do is just quickly dig into the sort of options for domestic hot water, sort of an update on where we stand technologically speaking, particularly with the large scale, because this has been a huge question, huge topic. So I figured I'd give sort of the insider look that I have sort of working on some projects that are designing these systems. So particularly large scale heat pump water heating plants for domestic hot water systems in a multifamily context, or you could apply it to even hotel building or really any sort of building that has a reasonable energy demand for domestic hot water. So a few years ago, we really didn't have options on the market available for large centralized systems for heat pump water heating. There had been some products that really were used more for chilling air, and as a result of that, we're sort of creating hot water as a byproduct. So they weren't sort of tuned towards the production of domestic hot water per se. They were tuned more for sort of acting as a chiller. But really the big question has been, how, particularly in this climate, do these how has the technology evolved to perform in cold weather sort of climates like we have in the Northeast? And I can say, as of right now, we do see upwards of about, I'd say, 3 or so different manufacturers and units that are on the market that are sort of providing performance data in cold weather and do seem to be suitable for cold weather performance. That said, there is a drop in performance like any heat pump system when it gets colder out. We understand that to be just part of the science behind it. So we just need to account for that in our designs and ensure that we have enough capacity and storage built in or backup as needed to produce hot water in extremely cold temperatures. But that said, we do have sort of this data available to do that sort of analysis. So where we're at right now is we do actually have options on the market. And actually 3 is probably a bit of an understatement. There's probably actually more like 4 to 5 now that I think about it. And there's different configurations. You can use CO2 as a refrigerant, and there's many options on the market now that have that option as compared to sort of conventional refrigerant base like our 410A or 134, that sort of stuff. So there are some options out there. I think where we're at right now is trying to break the barrier of getting these installed and commissioned and show that, hey, this not only can be designed in theory, it actually works in reality. So in New York City, we have 2 pilot projects that have a sort of gang of stand-in heat pump water heaters creating a heat pump water heating plant, essentially, providing hot water for 2 different multifamily buildings that was just recently commissioned. So they're still undergoing the commissioning process, but it's a pilot project to show that this approach can work. We do have other projects in design with hopes that we'll see some projects actually get installed and come online in the next year or so, hopefully. So that's kind of where we're at, and I just wanted to kind of give an update on that. And actually, the last thing I will say too, and this is a sort of exciting topic, is that we are seeing some projects now start to strongly consider using wastewater heat recovery to provide heating energy to their domestic hot water. And we've actually seen data that shows very, very good performance, COPs in the 4 to 5 range for these types of systems, and have the ability to meet capacities for large scale multifamily buildings with the wastewater heat recovery system. So we're seeing some really, really exciting stuff from the technological side. I think we're really at this inflection point now. Like, it actually feels like it. Maybe 3 years ago it was like more theory, but now I feel like we're there. But it's just about sort of breaking that barrier and getting the first few in operation. So I just wanted to sort of serve or provide that update to you guys. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to sort of get into that.
Thanks, Dylan. And Matt and Anna, I don't know if you want to bring in some questions from the audience. We have a few minutes left here in the hour. I know we've kind of taken up most of it with our chat. But if there's anything else you want to add in here, and I want to also just sort of reiterate thanks to the hosts, Connecticut Passive House, and Energize Connecticut and Eversource, and to remind people about this fabulous incentive program that is being hosted in Connecticut. I'm very envious that this is in place. We don't have anything like this in California yet. The information you can find for on these rebate and incentive programs is here for energizect.com/passivehouse, or email this email here. So I don't know if there's anything additional. Keegan and Anna, if we want to flip to some questions.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so there were a couple questions. Some of them I think were kind of specific to the slides, so I'll do our best here to go through them. So around the PER factors, there were a couple questions. Are the PER factors integrated into the PHPP? And if not, like where would that information be? And then also, are they PER factors localized based on project location? Like, do those vary from location to location?
So I can take that. Yes is the short answer. So when you click on your climate and your city and your region in the PHPP, most of the cities already in the PHPP already have PER factors associated with them, so it's already embedded, it's been done. If you get your specific climate data calculated by the PHI, by the Passive House Institute for a specific project, if it's not close to or in one of the cities that's already in the PHPP, they will also generate PER factors for your particular project. So I get that done routinely for my projects here in California. I've been doing a few out in sort of more rural, remote areas that are not in specific climates, already in the PHPP, and it's been about $300, $400, depending on the euro exchange rate, for a climate data set, so not expensive, and you do get your specific PER factors. And as I showed in my slides, they are very regional and locally specific to your project. Dylan's
Great.
probably got some experience with that on larger projects, because I know, some more complex building types also, there's been some shift and some innovation in that. I don't know if you've got anything to add there, Dylan.
Yeah, I mean, I think you sort of hit it. Our projects are mostly located in sort of popular climate file locations. So we're sort of there's been some I think projects. I think we had one in Massachusetts that was in sort of a funky area that we went to PHI to get specific factors for in climate files. But for the most part, we're just using the built-in stuff.
Yeah, it's all already embedded in the PHPP, so you know, you get it with the model. And I think the model is still like $300, $275, something silly cheap.
So Dylan and Bronwyn, do you guys have a few more minutes for questions, or did you have to stop at 1?
No, I actually have till 1:30 on my calendar for this, so I'm here for another 29 more minutes to answer questions.
I'm available too, so that's
okay. All right, good. Yeah, I think we had it scheduled till 1:30. So great. So yeah, there are some additional questions I think we can go through. Do the ratings differentiate between air source and ground coupled heat pumps?
Yeah, so I think ratings could be interpreted a few different ways, but I'm going to just interpret it as the COP, or coefficient of performance, i.e. efficiency, and capacity as the sort of two main ratings that we typically look at. So the ground source heat pumps will have a more consistent rating over the course of the year, just because the ground temperature essentially remains, or the water that it's sourcing it from remains much more sort of smooth and consistent over the course of the year because of the ground's sort of insulating qualities. So because of that, we see a fairly consistent COP rating and a fairly good COP rating and heating capacity and cooling capacity from a ground sourced system when you compare it to an air source system. So the air source system will be, especially in these climates, more susceptible to colder temperatures, which translates to reduced capacity and reduced efficiency. From what I've seen, and I'm just looking at some data here from a couple of different heat pump water heating manufacturers. So this is more from a domestic water heating side of things. Seeing the COP drop, anywhere from mid to high 3s in sort of the summer seasons. So a COP, let's say, of 3.5 or 4 in the summer seasons here, that will drop down to about a 2 or so, or maybe even a little bit lower than that, like high 1s in the sort of extreme cold temperature. So, when it gets to around 10 degrees Fahrenheit out, let's just say it's an example, you might see that COP drop to about a 2 or about in half. I've seen.
So Dylan, I think that I just want to interject here, because I think the question is, do you get the credit for the more efficient version of the ground source? And the short answer is yes. Yeah. You actually get to input the coefficient of performance into the PHPP, and you get factored in for that beneficial COP. So I think you do get the credit. It does account for the difference between the ground source version and the air source one. So it is accounted for. I think it's the quick answer. I don't know if that was. Sorry, I interrupted you. You got really into the weeds on the specifics there.
No, that's good. I'm glad you clarified, because that is a really important point that you absolutely can take credit for that. So definitely something to consider. And ground source makes a lot of sense in a lot of cases. It also has a lot of challenges, particularly locationally, dealing with soils and bedrock, and just the costs can sometimes be prohibitive. So but it needs to be considered for sure, and we're seeing projects still install it. One really interesting thing, we have 2 passive house buildings on Long Island, Far Rockaway, New York, right up kind of right on the beach, and it's the Beach Green Dunes project, Beach Green 1 and Beach Green 2, and they're pretty much the same building geometrically speaking and massing wise, the number of units and utilization. It's affordable multifamily, but they're like, couldn't be more different in terms of what went into the building in terms of wall construction. It's completely different backup wall, like ICF versus more conventional construction. It's one building did VRF, the other did ground source heat pumps. One building.
And that was intentional as a way to track the difference, or was it just sort of like the process got changed along the way? How did that happen?
I think it was a little bit of both, to be honest. I think it was more just sort of the process and sort of getting into costs was a big thing as well, like as they sort of price certain systems and whatnot. The really, really interesting thing is that they have virtually the exact same EUI over even over years of monitored data now at this point. And the end use consumption is very, very similar. So we're seeing space heating EUIs be virtually the same with the completely different systems. So
and different occupants, right?
And different occupants. Yeah, it's kind of a crazy thing that's still boggling our brain. But that said, I do want to make the point that even though you can still take credit for this performance, I think there's a lot to still be learned in terms of how these systems perform, and there's just so much data out there and not enough monitoring of these systems to really know how well they perform. But coming back to Bronwyn's original point, like, yes, you can take credit for that enhanced efficiency for sure.
So that kind of segues, I think, into another good question that's been asked a couple times in different ways. But so given our audience today, we did have a number of folks that identified as policymakers. Since most policymakers don't have the technical knowledge around some of the things we've discussed today, in what ways would you suggest policymakers can take this information and use it effectively?
It's a great question. It's something that I've definitely been working on in my capacity as at the Passive House Network. We've really been looking at supporting policymakers to transition to incentivize energy models that actually do support a renewable energy grid. And as Dylan really pointed out, the old PE framework used in Passive House really doesn't do that anymore. So I've really been advocating at a policy level to say only incentivize all electric Passive House buildings. It's something in California, the Decarbonization Coalition has really launched and pushed quite effectively, and I see it's really kind of now taking hold in on the East Coast, where people are realizing that's really how we are going to be able to support a renewable grid, is if buildings essentially are all electric. It's an easy way to say Passive House, all electric are the ones that get the incentive credits. Because it just is another message, it's a signal to the marketplace that that's where policy needs them to go. And it comes back to that slide I put in, connecting the dots between what the greenhouse gas emission legislative requirements, the mandates are from our states, don't always connect directly to what the code is saying, because in California, our code still allows gas equipment, which I think is just shocking. It's just because the code is really the bottom end of the market. It's the baseline, it's the back end of what's legally allowed. But what as a policy, what I'm really hoping to have set in place is policymakers need to tell the industry where they want us to go as practitioners. And that's a signal by saying, oh, these are the incentives. We're going to give favorable treatment to all electric passive house, that sends a really clear signal. And, you know, as Dylan was talking about equipment, you know, what's actually available on the market. And that's sort of part of that policy conversation where the market, including the manufacturers, haven't been given a clear signal about where we want them to go. And as soon as manufacturers get that clear signal saying this is where code is eventually going to go, doesn't have to be there now, but this is where we want you to go, they'll start supplying that equipment, and we'll have more than 3 choices, right, Dylan? I mean, you're, you know, what you're saying, and I've been screaming about this in California. You know, I get to travel a lot with my passive house advocacy. I go to other countries and I see they have 10 options, you know, bazillion more than what we have. I got 3, you know, and this is California. I'm working in the 5th largest economy in the world, and I'm using, you know, essentially old school equipment. I just don't have the supply chain in place, and that's a policy mechanism, because the signals haven't been sent to the industry about where we need to go. So clear signals, where we're going, end direction, end goals is what policymakers really need to send, not only to practitioners like myself. I mean, and as I mentioned, we've seen the writing on the wall since 2013. I've been doing all electric passive house, using the PER framework, because when it came out, I was like, oh yeah, this makes so much sense. But the rest of the market needs to get that religion, and sometimes you need to just tell them what it is. I don't know, Dylan, if you've got anything else. That's my, you know, my policy soapbox. I could get on that one pretty easily.
Yeah, no, I think that was good, honestly. You know, the thing I'd add to this is that, and this is why I think passive house is such a great framework and rubric for bringing up the sort of bottom end of the building market, the sort of code-driven building market, as Bronwyn, you were mentioning, is right now, you know, gas heating is still very much being done, and especially you know, in commercial buildings as well. Gas heating is really something that still exists, and the sad thing is that we have the technology, we have all those options to do that all electrically. So right now, what is really a key thing to understand is that to make electrification sort of more complete and broad stroking for the end of the building sector that is more just driven by code, is how do we bring the code to a level that reduces heating loads in these buildings to the point that these buildings no longer need to install large gas air handlers to do their heating. They can get away with a smaller capacity system for heating, and not have to deal with sort of the cost implications when you have such a high heating load and you want to heat that electrically. So really it comes down to this passive house principle that, you know, we need to reduce the load first by doing common sense measures in terms of air sealing, and just proper insulation levels, and, you know, high performance windows. And in this area, passive house means triple pane windows. It's probably still a little far-fetched to think the code will require triple pane windows in this cycle, but I think that's where we're ultimately heading, is just, you know, cost effectively reducing our loads so that way we can save on the capacity of the systems that are electric, and also the operating costs as well. So at a minimum, we can do space heating well. Domestic hot water, I think the technology hasn't been tried and true and tested enough to make that sort of code required sort of all electric. But that said, we are seeing gas moratoriums in New York and even in Massachusetts. So sooner or later it's going to come.
49 cities in California as well. So, you know, it's just, that's where the writing is on the wall, and that is a good, clear signal. But but as you say, you know, we're also having a product supply chain issue, and that's sort of something that only happens when there's a real market. So the HVAC folks on the call can, you know, tell us, you know, what they can actually get at the distribution center for product really only starts to change when the signal has been sent ahead of time. And baseline code is not a future, you know, future signaling mechanism. But I'm really pleased these programs, like this one from Energize Connecticut, these are perfect mechanisms. I've seen this policy actually transform a region's building industry, because it's telling the market where you guys want it to go. So I'm delighted to support this effort by Energize Connecticut. It's been really tried and true and tested. Massachusetts is doing it really well. NYSERDA and New York is doing the same program. I'm seeing similar programs being implemented. Vancouver did a great job of doing something similar. So, you know, these are the mechanisms that have been effective. And then they end up, what I'm seeing also is actually they end up supporting baseline code because they make it easier. The industry sort of gets their feet wet on these sort of pilot projects, and manufacturers start to see a business model for actually producing this high performance all electric equipment, and that's where you get real transformation.
So specific to Connecticut, there's a related question, I think. Mentioning that Connecticut has an active network in the state, obviously, to advocate for passive house incentives in affordable housing in the QAP, but it doesn't necessarily differentiate what type of passive house model is used. Do specific incentives for all electric, specifically all electric passive house, exist in any QAPs that you guys are aware of?
I haven't seen that, and it's a nuance that I have been, you know, advocating for. I think it's sort of a you know, version 2.0 for those incentive programs, the QAP incentive programs, because as Dylan mentioned, the PE and the sort of the old passive house models are still available to be used and are being used by different developers, because what I'm hearing from the larger projects, and Dylan, you can probably verify this, it's primarily a function of operating cost and gas still being cheaper, you know, to use than electricity. So it's a sort of a pricing function at the operational end for the end user. And, you know, I don't know whether that's, you know, transitioning, but again, you know, incentive programs are how you can actually shift that. And, you know, maybe those QAP programs adding all electric passive house will actually shift to this PER framework, because it, you know, it has been available. It's been out since 2015. The Institute did launch it as a, you know, as a pilot sort of model and option. They said they're not willing to say only use the PER framework, because there are many countries that they certify in that literally don't have good electric options at the moment. And, you know, passive house is still at its core an efficiency program, with efficiency being the first renewable resource. So I don't know, Dylan, if that's been your experience with the larger builds, but, you know, you did mention that much more of your projects are going to the PER framework now. So I don't know if that's something you can speak to.
Yeah, I think on the QAP front specifically, and I can definitely speak to that. No, but on the QAP front, I believe in Connecticut a couple of years ago, there was actually added incentive bonus points for the QAP points process for a pass-fail certified building. That was met with some pushback by the building industry, and we fought hard to keep it in as best as we can. And this was over multiple years too of rounds of the QAP. And I think where we landed last year was that it really got cut back and rolled back, and to the point where pass-fails was no longer providing any sort of additional points for the Connecticut CAFA QAP. But we were able to really push hard in the public comment period to at least get more points allocated for sustainable design measures. So, so I think that's where we left off. I certainly want to double check where that ultimately landed, and where it might be headed in the sort of coming years. But I mean, we have seen it been very effectively implemented in Pennsylvania, and that was one of the biggest drivers to that market, was getting the similar incentives in there in the QAP for the affordable housing projects and just multifamily development in Pennsylvania. So it certainly is an effective tool. I think it's just making sure that the policymakers are educated as to why it's effective and the sort of the effect that it's having on the market, and showing the growth from those incentives is something that we really need to keep highlighting for the policymakers, so that way when they're met with pushback, they can come back and say, you know, well, this is actually working, and it's not just this sort of carrot to sort of sustainability. It's actually working really well. So that's just on the QAP front. But as it relates to sort of projects actually doing electrification, energy cost is certainly a big concern. However, you know, we've seen some data, none of which I can share, but in the Northeast, that sort of trying to project when the cost for electricity could be more on a per kBTU basis, more in line with what we see for natural gas. And what I've seen is that that sort of crossover point is still a bit of a ways out, probably, you know, 20 to 30 years at least before the actual, if you look at dollars per kBTU used, is, however, the really important caveat to that is that that's if you look at just the dollars per kBTU. The thing to keep in mind is that a gas water heater, I'm going to speak in terms of water heating just because that's, I think, one of the biggest nuts to crack, is the gas water heating can really only max out in efficiency in the low to mid 90% efficient range, or a COP, if you will, of 0.9, 0.92. Heat pump water heating, heat pumps in general, can get COPs, you know, I mentioned annual average at sort of worst case, probably somewhere in the 2.0 range for domestic hot water. Could get even higher than that if we do ground-based systems or wastewater heat recovery. We could see COPs in the 3 to 5 range potentially. That drastically shifts when electricity is more expensive or less expensive with the gas, because you're using less electricity. So that's the other really, really important factor, is that yes, it might be 2 times more expensive on a per kBTU basis from now until 2040, 2050, whenever that is. But by 2030,
well, your equipment is like 3 times more efficient. Yeah. No, it's so interesting.
Yeah. So when you look at it, when you factor in the efficiency, we've seen the year that crossover point shift by like 10 to 15 years. So, you know, that we might be talking 10 to 15 years, if not, you know, earlier. It really is up in the air, but I think it's something that's going to be sooner than people think, that electricity is going to be more cost favorable than natural gas. Obviously, that's
And
a bold statement, but I think it's something that you got to think about when you're designing buildings that are going to last for 100 years, 100+ years.
yeah, and Dylan, in my own projects here in California, we've seen measured COPs in 4 and 5 for our domestic hot water heaters, and that cost effectiveness, that switchover's already happened. So we've, like, it's just, and I have data on that one that my business partner Alan's collected. So it's we've seen the cost effectiveness of an all electric passive house being, that it's already here. But again, our climate is way more benign. California should already be doing passive house, all electric buildings because it's so easy.
You guys have easier.
So
And by the way, shameless quick plug here. I'm going to be talking about that more in the Passive House Accelerator showcase tonight, 6 p.m. Eastern and 3 p.m. Pacific. So, sorry, Keegan, I just had to
no, absolutely happy to do it. So we do have 4 minutes left in the session, but there was one question I just wanted to get to, and hopefully we can get a complete answer in 4 minutes. But around retrofits, quite a few people in the comments have asked, is this a viable and cost-effective option or solution for retrofits, and what is needed, especially in Connecticut and the Northeast, to make sure that the all-electric air source heat pump option is viable without the need for, say, a supplemental backup fossil fuel?
So short answer, yes. And that fabulous project, there's a lovely retrofit happening in New Haven. I think Dylan's company is working on it. It's the hotel, the Marcel Breuer Hotel. I'm super excited about that one. Residentially, definitely retrofits. There's a phased retrofit option. You can do it, you do the full energy model, the long-term model, and then you implement the key upgrades in phases, just to help with cost effectiveness. But Dylan, you can speak to the retrofit.
Yeah. Well, in 2 minutes, I'll quickly summarize. So on that building specifically, they did everything on the exterior was pretty much maintained in terms of the exterior facade. They replaced the windows, upgraded them to triple pane. So the envelope drastically improved in performance. One of the biggest challenges was just dealing with existing structure, and that's one of the biggest challenges in general with retrofit. That's not necessarily new or surprising information. However, that building was sort of gutted from the inside. So they were able to run new mechanical ducts and piping and plumbing and all that sort of stuff, which isn't always the case in retrofit projects. When you're talking about retrofitting an existing building on the space heating side, if they have fossil fuel or like steam-based heating, one of the first big questions is, can we use the existing piping in the building for a hydronic-based system? And what we think is really an exciting, promising design option is to do what we call like a low-temp hydronic system, or essentially use that existing piping and change out, if you have like a radiator-based system, you would swap out for like a fan coil or hybrid heat pump sort of system in the terminal units, but use that existing piping to get hot and cold water from a central plant that you would sort of install on a roof or in a mechanical room, with like a heat pump water heating central plant sort of thing. And that's something that I think is very promising, and we're starting to consider and see on some projects, particularly in the New York City region, where we have a lot of buildings we need to retrofit. The domestic hot water side, the good thing is that you're pretty much you can use the existing piping. It's just about converting the existing plant over. I think one of the bigger challenges is just getting the electrical capacity of the building, and this is something you really got to keep in mind, is that when you do electrify to electric-based water heating, even with a heat pump system, you will see an increase in needed electrical capacity of the building. So that's something that has to be considered, and thought about as that retrofit happens. So, but you know, there are definitely options. It's definitely possible, and Hotel Marcel is a really, really awesome example of it coming to fruition. So happy to respond to questions if you want to shoot me an email and want to learn more about it.
That's great. Thanks, guys. And yeah, that brings us right to 1:30. So I think with that, we can conclude today's session. So thanks so much to you, Bronwyn and Dylan, for joining and for all the really valuable information today. And we'll look forward to the next one.
Fabulous. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks to everyone who attended today. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.